Hall River Assembly and with the Orange County Interfaith Care for Creation Group. Boy, did the Presbyterians show up. It was so much fun, and one of Katie's kids said, "It's like an Easter egg hunt, except people thank you." Because everybody that walked by just said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." It was just, and there was no pollen because the rain was gone. So we don't have a working microphone. We sacrificed our microphone to Youth Sunday. So fortunately, as Ashley tells me frequently, I am very loud, and so that shouldn't be a problem. But if I'm not loud enough, I'd love to be louder. It's my favorite thing. So today I'm going to talk about earth care right here in North Carolina, focusing particularly on conserving our state's land and water. And one of the main calls to action I'm going to share, and I know a lot of you already do this to varying degrees with various organizations, so I'm going to ask even those of you in that category to even more support, join, and connect with our amazing environmental and conservation groups right here in North Carolina, like the Hall River Assembly. Fantastic group. That was the 33rd year that they've done the clean-up-a-thon, and I am predicting it's going to be, based on how heavy our stuff was, it's going to be a record year for them. So, thanks to everybody.
Which is good and bad.
Good and bad, yes. It's sort of like composting. Record amount of composting. Wow, are we wasting too much food? Yeah. So, you know. So, my neighbor, Johnny Randall, posted this last month on Facebook. What's wrong with this picture? Okay, we've got February 28th, too early to be blooming, and I'm sure these were blooming well before that. What else? Bradford pears. What's wrong with Bradford pears? Non-native, invasive, create food deserts for birds in this area. What else is wrong with this picture?
Lots of utilities.
Okay. We're going to talk about that next week with our clean energy class. But how about that Welcome to Chapel Hill sign? Welcome to Chapel Hill, non-native invasive Bradford pears. Come on, we can do better. As a matter of fact, the North Carolina State Extension Forestry Service has put a bounty on Bradford pears, teaming up with the North Carolina Forest Service and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation to encourage North Carolinians to properly remove and replace these invasive trees.
How do you properly remove them?
I have no idea.
Cut them down. You don't just cut them down.
I think maybe they kind of kudzu a little bit.
You gotta get the stump
They
up.
die early.
They
Yeah.
split.
They're quick growers, but they go away fast.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of you have noticed the record warmth that we've had and everything blooming earlier than just about ever, at least in my memory. The sub-headline here points out that this is growing more common and that, quote, dangerously hot days in North Carolina are expected to increase sixfold by 2050. On the right side, notice the fact that WRAL now has a dedicated climate change reporter. That's a good thing. And it's not just North Carolina. As you know, the 8 warmest years globally on record were, you guessed it, the last 8 years. So in addition to heat, here are some of the extraordinary flooding events we've had in North Carolina just in the last 18 months. In 2021, in Haywood County in western North Carolina, 6 people died and over 400 structures, including most of the town of Canton's municipal buildings, were destroyed after up to a foot of rain associated with Tropical Storm Fred flooded the Pigeon River. Just take a look at this. There's the Pigeon River. And that is a football field. 6 people died. Yeah. And I'm sure y'all saw this.
Don't be shy.
This is from Rodanthe in the Outer Banks, just last year. This was from last week, also in Rodanthe.
For another oceanfront home kind of Advocacy, look at this video of a home washing away into the Atlantic. This is off East Point Drive in Regenerative.
The National Park Service is warning people to watch out for any debris that may wash up. Pieces of the home are scattered up and down the beach. Officials are working with the owner to remove the house and clean up the debris.
These aren't inexpensive houses.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is the New York Times and Washington Post that these stories are in.
Yep.
For another,
Who remembers the hymn that we sang last week? I was sitting in my little live stream video closet up in the attic of the church, listening to this hymn and thinking, that is going to definitely work its way into next week's Sunday school class. Save me, O God, I sink in the floods. So as some of you may know, I am a documentary filmmaker, and I'm not sitting in the live stream video closet up in the sanctuary. I worked on a series of 17 short documentaries with the UNC Institute for the Environment a few years ago. They're called Climate Stories North Carolina, and they're each about 3 to 4 minutes long. We profiled a variety of people who live and work very closely to the land and water in the state and have compelling personal perspectives about the changes they see in the climate and their environment. I showed several of these 3 years ago when we had this this Earth Care Sunday School series 3 years ago. I'm not going to show any of them today, but I will show this little trailer that's 1 minute long that sort of is a teaser for several of them.
Well, I've been keeping the calendar for 20 years, but I've noticed over the years, just everything's blooming earlier. I think the world's just getting hotter.
We don't have as distinct seasons as we once did.
The first half of my life, I never saw 90 degrees in Western North Carolina. It just didn't happen. And now you see it fairly regularly, I'm sorry to say.
Winters are generally warmer, springs are generally wetter and cooler.
I've witnessed firsthand die-offs of fish that are not real accustomed to high water temperatures.
These very unstable temperatures, it feels like the planet trying to get its equilibrium.
The longer the summer and the longer the pollen season, and that means I'm gonna have more asthma triggers and more time suffering, basically.
Flowers aren't blooming when it's 110 degrees outside. There's no nectar, there's no food for the bees.
If March gets warm earlier than usual, the apple trees think it's springtime. And if the weather is cold enough, when those blossoms are exposed, they can wipe out the crop.
If this generation's not gonna do anything about it, then it's up to our generation to deal with the impacts and the world they left behind for us.
We need a diverse climate movement because it's really going to take all of us from many different backgrounds to help solve the issue of climate change.
We've been given this planet on loan, and it's our responsibility to be a good steward and to take care of it.
So these are all available on the PBS North Carolina website at pbsnc.org. And I almost showed the one about Bill Carson, the apple grower up at the orchard at Altapass along the Blue Ridge Parkway, just because it's so relevant to what we're experiencing now with this early spring coming in February or early March. March, and then the freezes that we've had, which were just perfectly timed for this class. All right, so let's pretend just for fun that it's the future, and we're looking back from 2030 or 2040 about how we used what we now know in the early 2020s to save the planet. We could pull a full 11 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere. That's 1/3 of all the carbon emissions we need to reduce to keep our planet within a reasonable amount of warming. So how could nature do this? Let's watch this video from the Nature Conservancy.
The 2020s, things were never the same after that. That's when we saved the world. Only we almost didn't.
It all changed once we realized the difference working with nature could make. Back then, we were all about electric cars, renewable energy, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. And they were all crucial, but on their own, they never would have been enough. We were already facing an extinction-level threat. We thought we were doing a lot, but we needed to do even more. Enter nature. The most sophisticated system for processing greenhouse gases in the universe only had hundreds of millions of years on us. We had to stop the planet from warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the start of the 20th century. Turns out we had to be kind to nature. Hear me out. Stopping the destruction of existing forests, grasslands, and wetlands pulled 3.9 billion metric tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. Smarter farming and forestry techniques cut another 5.1 billion tons. And restoring the forests and wetlands we had lost scrubbed another 2. That's 11 billion tons of carbon removed from the atmosphere. That's like a string of SUVs stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic stretching from here to the moon 56 times over. That's 1/3 of the emission reductions we needed. How's it work though? Pick a tree, any tree. Look closer. Trees do this awesome thing called photosynthesis where they soak up rays of sun and pluck carbon from the air to feed themselves. They literally eat the stuff that traps heat in our atmosphere. And have you heard of mangroves? They're like trees, but they live along the coast near bays and beaches. They became all the rage when word got out they could store 5 times more carbon than their landlocked counterparts. Plus, as they age, trees, all plants really, deposit their carbon into soil. Other plants use that to grow, some of which get eaten by animals, like us, which release carbon back into the atmosphere, starting the whole process over again. It's called the carbon cycle, and it worked really well for a really long time until we overloaded the system by burning fossil fuels and cutting down too many of our forests. It can look very natural now, but protecting and restoring nature at a global level was one of the hardest things we've ever done, and we still had to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But once we realized it would take more than switching to renewable energy, once we really partnered with nature to reduce our carbon footprint, and also to live on a better planet,
that's when we really started to save the world.
Love the Nature Conservancy. So, I sure hope that comes true. So, let's make it come true. How are we going to do that? Right here in North Carolina. So, even if they had nothing to do with climate change, North Carolina's land and water are our state's most important economic assets. 4 of the major engines of North Carolina's economy, agriculture, tourism, forestry, and the military, all depend directly on natural and working lands and clean water. Just a quick personal note, it wasn't climate change, it wasn't economics that brought me to land and water conservation about 16 years ago. So, as some of you know, I was born, because I mentioned it last time I led a Sunday school class, I was born up in Banner Elk near Grandfather Mountain. Grew up swimming, hunting, fishing in those mountains all over that area. But up until my mid-40s, I had been just sort of an armchair conservationist. And by that I mean every now and then, not even every year, I'd write a small check to the Nature Conservancy or some similar organization and feel really good about it, and that was it. But then in 2007, my life flashed before my eyes. Caldwell County, North Carolina, was seriously considering a Florida developer's proposal to build 225 houses along a 5-mile stretch of Wilson Creek, which is one of North Carolina's only 4 national wild and scenic rivers in this state. Its source is on the highest point of Grandfather Mountain, from which it plummets under the Blue Ridge Parkway, through Pisgah National Forest, and very close to land that has been in my family for my entire life. Ashley and our kids, Wade and Eleanor, love this place more than anywhere on earth. We baptized Wade and Eleanor with water from there. They were probably 10 and 5 in these pictures. Wade's now 25, Eleanor's 20. But just imagine 225 houses and no trespassing signs along the banks of some of the most pristine swimming, kayaking, and fishing water, trout water that you have ever seen. And Wilson Creek feeds the Catawba River, which is the drinking water supply for Morganton, Hickory, and Charlotte. People from all over the country who love Wilson Creek, including me, Ashley, our kids, and everyone that we have ever taken there, which is a gazillion people over the last 40 years, dating all the way back to college days, wrote letters voicing strong opposition to this development to Caldwell County. So I was certainly no longer an armchair conservationist at that point. Ultimately, the local land trust that works in Caldwell and surrounding counties, Foothills Conservancy, with help from the statewide Conservation Trust from North Carolina, was able to make sure with state funding that this amazing land and water would be protected as trout water owned by the state of North Carolina completely and forever. So with funding from the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, Foothills bought the entire 650-acre tract and transferred ownership to the state, which now manages it for public trout fishing and water quality. So that was my backyard. But it made me think long and hard about how everybody has a backyard or a place that they care about just as much as I care about this. And a lot of people don't have backyards at all here in North Carolina and beyond. That was my first introduction to the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, and that was exactly 10 years before Governor Roy Cooper appointed me to be a trustee of the North Carolina Land and Water Fund. It was also my introduction to the incredible work of local land trusts and the statewide Conservation Trust for North Carolina. And so here's a little 15-second video about this property now.
This Day on the Water is brought to you by the North Carolina Land and Water Fund.
That is a great place to go fishing, Bob and Dana. We talked about fishing as we were cleaning up Bowling Creek yesterday, which is not the best place to go fishing. Yeah, but it will be as soon as UPC gets out there.
The sand from land.
Yeah. So I joined the board of the Conservation Trust for North Carolina right after that experience, and absolutely loved serving on that board for 9 years. In 2012, about 5 years after I joined the board, I made a short video for the Conservation Trust, and I want to just show you the final 3 minutes of that real quickly now. You won't see name titles for several of the folks who appear in the video because they had appeared in the first half of the video, and that's when I identified them. I'll just tell you who they are real quick. First will be former Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation Executive Director Tom Lambeth, who probably several of you know in here, followed by philanthropist and conservationist Fred Standback, former UNC System President Bill Friday, my fellow Land and Water Fund trustee Jason Walzer, and then writer Lee Smith, who probably the most of us in this room know and love.
powerful statements I ever heard about the need to preserve the land was made some years ago by the late Roy Taylor, who represented the far western part of the state in Congress for many years and who absolutely loved western North Carolina and its mountains and its peaks and its valleys and all of that. And Roy once, in arguing for a conservation effort, said, if we lose this, if we let this land be destroyed, God may forgive us, but our grandchildren never will.
Saving these beautiful places that we have in North Carolina has great spiritual value, and it's an obligation we have to the future. We're the beneficiaries of people that saved the national parks and many of the places that we now have, and we have that same obligation to save what we can for the future generations.
And as long as I'm able to do it, I'm going to be a contributor, because I want to see these things not only preserved, but I want them put up front where young people can say, well, gee whiz, I better go and visit, and I better do it right now.
When I hear Bob White calling or whippoorwill at night, I'm reminded that not only is our farm preserved for myself and Charlie and our family, but the larger biology of our area is preserved. The culture of the farm too is preserved. I see other farms and areas that have lost so much, and when I hear that natural component of the environment speak its voice or show itself in whatever way, I know we've done the right thing.
And I believe that we are all called today to preserve the infrastructure that our future citizens are going to need for their water, for their food, for their quality of life, for their spiritual values. We are called to preserve a few of the best places that we have today for the future of tomorrow.
I feel so strongly that our identity as a people comes from our land. You know, it comes from our tall mountains, it comes from our rolling farmland, it comes from our fragile shores, and we will only be the best possible people that we can be as long as we will accept this responsibility and take care of this land and nourish it as it has nourished us.
So, if you are not already a member of a land trust, please join a land trust. Support a land trust. Ideally, right here locally, Triangle Land Conservancy. It is a wonderful place to start. In its 40-year history, Triangle Land Conservancy has conserved over 20,000 acres. Don't just join and support them. Go for a hike on one of their amazing nature preserves. You can see the list. It's on their website. These are right here within a very short driving distance, maybe even a bike ride distance from where some of you all live. People desperately want to be outside in North Carolina, taking advantage of our natural resources, and boy do we know it more than ever because of COVID. Record state park attendance in 2020, again in 2021. We all know this firsthand. We all were so desperate to be outside as much as possible over the last 3 years, and I think everybody is used to that more than ever, and we're going to keep doing it even when COVID is completely in the rearview mirror. So why are land and water conservation so important? I thought this from the National Land Trust Alliance was helpful. In the United States, we lose almost 200 acres of natural and farmland every hour. That's about 1.6 million acres per year lost forever, more than the entirety of Grand Canyon National Park. Over the last decade, North Carolina has added almost 1 million people. And accelerating population growth places increasing demands on the state's natural resources. It also makes it increasingly difficult to protect environmental quality. The red on this map shows development of natural and farmland for the last decade, ending in 2016. And looking forward, over 2 million acres of North Carolina natural and farmland are at risk of development in the next 30 years. So in addition to Triangle Land Conservancy, here are some of the members of the National Land Trust Alliance that work right here in the Triangle area. And I know you all are familiar with some or all of these. The land trusts on this slide alone have protected almost 70,000 acres. Conserved lands also help stabilize the climate and ensure human and natural communities become more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So how do land trusts help tackle climate change? They protect forests and grasslands that pull carbon from the air. They provide safe havens for plants and animals by identifying and conserving lands that will be most resilient to climate change, that have been carefully identified as those that have the best chance to be the most resilient to the climate change. They also conserve lands that will provide people with buffers from natural disasters. For example, the types of flooding that we talked about earlier. So North Carolina's 3 main conservation trust funds are the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, which I have the privilege of serving as a trustee on, the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, and the Agricultural Development and Farmland Preservation Trust Fund. These help make land and water protection projects across North Carolina possible. Might be a little hard to read, I'll tell you what it says. These 3 trust funds have protected over 500,000 acres of watershed. They funded 900 local park projects and protected over 22,000 acres of family farms across the state. So as I mentioned, Governor Cooper appointed me to serve as a trustee 5 years ago to the Land and Water Fund, and then in 2021 he appointed me to chair the board of the Land and Water Fund. It was created by the General Assembly in 1996. It was originally known as the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, so the name was changed a couple years ago. Some of you may know it by that name. In its 27 years, the fund has conserved over 500,000 acres and protected and restored 3,000 miles of streams and rivers across North Carolina. All these wonderful dots on the map are conservation projects that we funded. We have an annual grant cycle. Last September, we granted $70 million with state funding to 117 projects across the state that will protect over 27,000 acres, most of which will eventually be open to the public for hiking, hunting, boating, birding, other recreational uses. I know I'm going fast here, I'm just blasting through this. I'm one of 9 trustees. 5 of us are appointed by the governor, who, as I'm sure you all know, is currently a Democrat. 2 are appointed by the North Carolina Senate President, a Republican. 2 by the Speaker of the North Carolina House, also a Republican. It is a wonderfully bipartisan board. I just sent chills down my own back thinking about how much I love serving on this board. I think nonpartisan is a better word than bipartisan, despite how we were appointed. On average, each state dollar, your dollars, that we grant is matched by almost 2 additional dollars, mostly from private matching funds or from federal government matching funds. And our grant program is totally voluntary. We only work with willing landowners who want to put their land in conservation. We do not force anybody to do anything. In order to get a grant, you have to be either a state agency, like the North Carolina Division of State Parks or the Wildlife Resources Commission, or you have to be a local government, or a nonprofit whose main purpose is conservation or restoration of our state's natural and cultural resources, like the Nature Conservancy or Triangle Land Conservancy or the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation. We fund 4 primary types of projects. About 75% of our grant funds go towards land protection, either acquiring land outright, like the project along Wilson Creek. That was an acquisition project where that land was purchased and then becomes owned by the state. But we also purchase perpetual conservation easements on land, where the landowner continues to own it, but the development rights have been purchased and are permanently, that land is permanently protected. It's written into the deed, always and forever. So we call these acquisition projects, these land protection projects. We also do stream restoration projects with about 20% of our funds. We do stormwater projects, but they've got to be innovative. They've got to be something that somebody else can learn something from and put it to good use in the future. And then we also have planning grants. The acquisition projects are in 4 different categories: stream buffers and floodplains, natural heritage resources, typically rare or endangered plants or animals that are important for conserving the ecological diversity of North Carolina, including adapting to climate change, historic and cultural resources, and finally greenway projects along rivers and streams. Okay, I'd like to play you a 6-minute segment of a recent hour-long PBS North Carolina documentary called State of Change. Katie showed the trailer for this last week, and I think the entire documentary is excellent. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to. The link is on the EarthCare website, and I'm going to remind you where to find that at the end of this class. But the whole series explores the impacts of climate change from North Carolina's coast to its mountains. It emphasizes the importance of conserving the state's natural heritage. And wouldn't you know, the segment that I'm going to show you focuses on natural heritage around Grandfather Mountain and Wilson Creek. So the Land and Water Fund has funded multiple acquisition projects like the one I talked about earlier in that area. I did not produce this documentary for PBS North Carolina, but was asked to participate in it as a representative of the Land and Water Fund. And so I'll just show that to you right now.
The highest elevations in our southern Appalachian Mountains are very unique. They support some species of plants and animals that occur nowhere else on Earth, only in North Carolina at high elevations. There's a very long winter, a very short growing season, and there is a huge amount of rainfall and precipitation in these areas.
Most of the environments here have thin soils, they're very acidic. Here at Grandfather Mountain, we're known for our winds. We're one of the windiest places in the state.
The extreme environments of North Carolina's high elevation peaks play host to an ancient and rare ecosystem, the spruce fir forest.
We are sitting in the spruce fir forest near the top of Grandfather Mountain. This ecosystem is so important for providing habitat for several species of plants and animals that really are unique to this area. Red spruce, Fraser fir, galax, a variety of mosses and lichens, Heller's blazing star, and Roan Mountain bluet. These species are adapted to survive in these harsh conditions. They grow very slowly, they don't disperse very far. They're really limited to these mountain peaks, which we can think of as almost like islands in the sky. In order to survive over time, really they just hunker down. Their strategy is to persist.
So this is a small Fraser fir, and this is a good example of a small sapling that could be 40 to 50 years old that's in the understory here, just waiting for its opportunity to get sunlight and grow to the canopy.
When we're walking through old-growth forests, we often think about the trees as being old. But many people don't think about the herbs. This patch of galax took decades to establish. It's another reason we need to protect these natural areas and to think about how we can connect them to a resilient landscape.
Because of the 2,000-foot elevation change from its base to the peak, hiking from the bottom to the top of Grandfather Mountain can be compared ecologically with walking from Georgia all the way to Canada, which is what allows the area to support a huge diversity of species.
Grandfather Mountain is an international biosphere reserve. There's over 400 biospheres globally, and they identify the most unique places on the planet. Here at Grandfather, we have more than 70 listed rare and endangered plants and animals that call this place home. Many of those are endemic, meaning they're only found in 2 or 3 places on the planet.
But because they're so specially adapted, these species are threatened by shifts in temperature and precipitation caused by our changing climate.
We don't know how the species are going to be able to adapt over time. Historically, the Earth has warmed and cooled periodically, but the changes that we're seeing today may be happening faster than they happened in the past.
One of the things that's been interesting the last few years have been really heavy rainfalls in the spring, especially in May. The net, when you look at the annual precip, it's about the same as it's been in the past, but the way that that occurs is quite different. We've had 2 really epic 300-year flood events that have happened in back-to-back years in May. And of course, that's followed by droughts.
Warmer temperatures also mean that faster growing species from further down the mountain could creep upwards and outcompete the slower growing species at the top, like the red spruce and Fraser firs.
Here in North Carolina, there's been a lot of research looking at projections and estimations of how much temperature increase could cause retreat. We believe about 3 degrees would cause a 1,000-foot retreat of spruce fir forest. So 3-degree annual temperature could potentially take spruce fir forest off the top of Grandfather Mountain with time.
It's so important for us to recognize these places as unique for North Carolina and to protect them now, because if we lose them, we're not going to get them back.
Land conservation efforts are a critical tool for reducing human impact and keeping these unique places around for the future. Organizations like the Natural Heritage Program and the North Carolina Land and Water Fund work together with local governments and land trusts to establish a resilient network of nature preserves across the state.
So when we conserve a piece of land, we preserve and protect that land forever. Grandfather Mountain is remarkable ecologically in its own right. And fortunately, it's permanently protected, the entire mountain. But it actually extends well down the valley. For example, Wilson Creek has its source on the highest point of Grandfather Mountain and falls 4,000 feet vertically down into what is some of the best trout water in the southeastern United States. This landscape scale conservation, like Grandfather Mountain and the areas below it in the valley, are so important because it gives plants and animals a migration corridor during this time of intense stress with climate change.
And beyond protecting our prized natural areas like Grandfather Mountain, land conservation can actually play a critical role in mitigating the effects of climate change.
North Carolina has been protecting land for many, many years, and we've long recognized the value of land conservation for protecting wildlife habitat, for protecting these unique ecosystems. What we've learned more recently is that land conservation also helps reduce the effects of climate change by pulling carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere and storing carbon in our trees and our soils and below ground.
When you think about climate change and you think about the things that are happening in our world, there's some optimism there that we at least have protected the place so that we can allow those changes to play out.
So something I forgot to mention, I think, is that Wilson Creek is not named for my family. Sorry. Y'all are probably all sitting there thinking, man, this guy's a show-off. No. It's kind of a funny story that I don't have time to tell right now, but I'll tell it to you. The state's natural lands also play a vital role in flood protection. We have learned the hard way recently that many more areas of North Carolina are at risk of severe flooding than previously predicted. Protecting and restoring forests, wetlands, and farmlands along river corridors are highly effective and economical ways to reduce flood risks. This is just a quick example. I wanted to pop this in here just to show before and after of one of our flood restoration projects. We get some nasty streams in our applications. No in-stream habitat, really steeply incised banks where sediment just with every rain event continues to wash into that stream, and the type of restoration project, and this is one where the vegetation hasn't even come fully back in yet, but there's much more in-stream habitat here, and this stream now has access to the floodplain, where it can spread out and slow down during a big rain event. So, we just finished the first year of a wonderful pilot program at the Land and Water Fund. In last year's budget, we were appropriated an additional $15 million for grants to help reduce flood risk across the state. And we did projects, we did about 20 projects from the coast all the way up to the mountains, including in the Canton area where the 6 people died. All right, I want to talk about something that I know Marla is excited about also, because they actually had a speaker from the Nature Conservancy who addressed their Carroll Woods climate crowd, and Marla shared that presentation with me, and it's fantastic. So we expect at the Land and Water Fund to start seeing a lot more applications for projects like this. These peatland restoration projects not only reduce flood risk by restoring wetlands, they also sequester carbon and combat climate change incredibly effectively. So here's a remarkable fact. Peatlands cover just 3% of the Earth's surface, but store more than twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests combined. They span tropical rainforests, permafrost regions, and coastal plains, like the coastal plains that we have here in North Carolina. Let's watch a quick video that the Nature Conservancy made about peatland restoration project that they're doing. And I gotta remember to unmute him.
So habitat is dependent on this peat.
Pocosin Lakes was established to conserve a unique wetland type that we call Pocosin.
Pocosin habitat is dependent on this peat soil, which is about 50% carbon. It stores carbon as long as it stays seasonally saturated for rainfall. This landscape has been ditched and drained. That's drying out the peat soil.
Drying out the soil starts an oxidation process where we end up losing peat soil, and it also makes the land more susceptible to wildfire. When we get a fire started on the refuge, it can burn into the soil itself, and it can go for months at a time.
After a long wildfire, you lose up to several feet of that soil. That's no longer there to store carbon and to support the vegetation, the wildlife we're depending on. Doing restoration on these drained areas, we're stopping that loss of carbon and making sure that habitat is available for wildlife in the long run.
We're using water control structures and berms to stop the artificial drainage of rainwater, to re-wet the peat soils.
This is a proof of concept project showing how if you re-wet peat, you're actually able to get carbon credits for it. That's a financial incentive for folks, rather than letting the soil dry out, to restore it and actually get some benefit from it. If we put a little work into it, we can enjoy this landscape for longer, for my kids, for yours, for everybody.
Amazing projects. And in the presentation that Marla shared with me at Carroll Woods, the audience was so receptive that during the Q&A, a lot of the questions were like, how can we contribute? How can we contribute to this? How can we support this work? So thanks again, Marla. Wonderful.
Will you share how we can support this work with
Yes,
us?
absolutely. Here, that's where I'm getting. Here, now we're in the home stretch here. Here's another way you can take action. Let your elected officials in North Carolina know that you support North Carolina's conservation trust funds and that protecting the state's land and water is important to you. Also, your congressional representation, our representative and our 2 senators, because there is national funding that is even on a larger scale than here in North Carolina. So you may wonder, is this just John preaching this, or do North Carolinians really want lawmakers to fund land conservation projects? I'm going to just blow through this. Between 70 and 95% of North Carolinians support increasing funding for the 3 conservation trust funds, protecting drinking water, preserving working farms, protecting fish and wildlife, protecting forests, conserving beaches and coastal areas, and providing more opportunities for children to explore and learn about nature. You can see all of the members of North Carolina's Land for Tomorrow Coalition, including the Conservation Trust for North Carolina, the Nature Conservancy, Triangle Land Conservancy. Do you all remember 3 years ago, both Jay Lutzy, who spoke to this series and to the Earth Care Sunday School series, and I, Jay talking on a national level, me talking on a state level, said, please, you all, please contact your elected officials and let them know you care about funding for land and water conservation. Well, it really paid off. It really paid off here in North Carolina and nationally. 2 years ago, we appropriated $60 million. Last year, as I mentioned, $70 million. Those are funding levels that we have not seen for land conservation in the state of North Carolina in 15 years. Because people like you all let our elected officials here in North Carolina know that it matters to you. Yes, those percentages that I showed on the previous slide, if you walk up to an average North Carolinian and say, is this important, is this important? They're like, absolutely. But it's the follow through. It's the letting the elected officials know that makes the difference. Yes, indeed, big budget wins for land conservation in the state of North Carolina over the last 2 or 3 years. We did thank them. We thanked them and thanked them and thanked them. And even if you don't want to get into specific numbers, the best way to tell our elected officials or any elected official that you care is to thank them when they do something good, because they do sometimes do good. They do. And they love to hear from people then. They do. All right now, it is budget time in North Carolina. The governor has already released, as many of you may know, last week, his preliminary budget, asking for funding levels here. 30 million. Recurring means we get that same amount automatically every year, even if there's no budget agreement. The 20 million additional would bring our funding for this year, for next year, up to 50 million. The Land for Tomorrow Coalition is also asking that we continue the flood risk reduction program. Same levels for Parks and Rec Trust Fund. Okay, I'm not going to get into this, but I'm just going to tell you briefly. The governor asked for even more than the Land for Tomorrow Coalition asked for, by $5 million. So he asked for 30 recurring. We currently get 24 recurring. Up to 30, and he asked for an additional 25 to bring us to 55 million. Look what else the governor did in his budget. $5 million to start for the first time, this would be a first, peatland and Pecosins restoration to mitigate climate change and reduce flooding. Please help us protect North Carolina's conservation trust funds. On our website, upcch.org/earthcare, we have a big red link. It's actually not that big, I made it bigger. Additional resources for the 2023 class. And there's a section for each of the classes that we're doing. There's already 2 sections for Katie's 2 wonderful first classes. There's a section for this class. And here it all is. How to find this information that I've shared with you so fast, and I'm so sorry that I just have talked way too fast. Links to a bunch of wonderful land trusts. Also, here is a link that will enable you to plug in a map and say, hey, we've got a house in this part of Western North Carolina, or this part of the beach. What's the local land trust that works in that area? This link will show you that. Conservation action alerts. Okay, here is a quick promo for next Sunday's class on clean energy. And this is a wonderful documentary that has been recommended by Interfaith Power and Light, which is a wonderful interfaith partner in all things clean energy.
For those people in the fossil fuel industry, it is a simple truth that your business is going to go away.
It's just a matter of figuring out how to do that without leaving people behind or destabilizing the system.
There's 9 points of failure in the United States. You take any one of those out, then you could have partial grid collapse. And many of our bases are at the end of the power line.
We don't want to lose these military bases. One of the questions they're going to be asking is, does the base have its own power? There's virtually no one that is opposed to solar. Now that differs from our elected officials going against their constituents.
In 6 states across the country, power companies are fighting to change the rules.
We understand that their bottom line is investment. They've got to turn a profit.
There's an energy revolution going on.
Shouldn't I have the freedom to put solar panels up in my roof if I want? Should there really be a utility telling me, no, you can't do that? If they keep trying to push that, more and more people are just gonna disconnect from the grid.
I want the power company at the table when it comes to developing solar and EVs because they have the money, they have the infrastructure.
Put it on a moral foundation. Everyone has a right to clean water, to toxic-free air.
I believe God created this world and put that sun out there, in my opinion, for us to take advantage of.
This is the civil rights issue of our time.
Take care and protect my creation. We will stand as one united force.
We will not bend, we will not break, and we will not bow down.
It's really good. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't leave very much time for questions and discussion, but here we are, we've got 5 minutes left, so yes, Toby. Remember, no clean energy. You're saving clean energy.
I'm asking about Native Americans.
Uh-huh.
How did they live in North Carolina before the Europeans came? What parts of the mountain did they use? What parts of the rivers did they use? Do we know how that came about?
You are so far above my pay grade right now. Does anybody want to?
There's local evidence of things like fish weirs in Holland that must have been Native American made to channel fish to a convenient spot to harvest them. And just, I don't know that there's a holistic answer that explains everything that was done, but there's vestiges, little bits and pieces you can maybe make an imaginary scenario.
I bet they used the sides of the mountain where deciduous trees grew.
Let me ask you a question, Toby. What prompted you to ask that question? Was it the trailer?
Because protecting all the land.
Yeah.
Is protecting some land. Now, we have told people not to use the tops of the mountains.
Right. After we built Sugar Top on top of Sugar Mountain.
But what are we telling people who have stuff on the north side where it can't get the sun? Anyway,
so every time somebody's house falls in the ocean, or they say, we will rebuild, in the hurricane, we will rebuild. Is the state buying up properties to get people to not build back there?
So there is a lot of funding available, state and federal, for removing structures from flood-prone areas. Now, clearly in Rodanthe, they've passed, I think, what everyone down there would agree is a tipping point. But as a lot of us know, in other parts along the coast, they are hunkering down, and they are, they want to stay put, they want to rebuild. Fortunately, we're getting smarter about the way we try to protect along coastlines with sea level rise, and we do fund projects like this. We're not as much hardening shorelines as we used to by building seawalls and just putting rock there. We're now doing projects called living shorelines, which are oyster shells that are bagged, and one of the segments in the State of Change documentary is about living shorelines, and we fund a lot of living shoreline projects at the North Carolina Land and Water Fund. I love them because it allows the shoreline to retreat more naturally, and it allows vegetation and other aquatic life to persist. Whereas when you build a hardened seawall, that's it. That's the end of the line. As the sea rises, everything down there that wants to remain alive is gonna drown, unless it's a fishy that can swim away. But grasses and things that need to be right on the shoreline. Yes.
You talk about all these really hopeful projects that are going on. In your subjective estimation, what percentage is that of what is needed to happen? You know what I mean? Like, how close are we to doing what we need to do?
We are not close at all on a global systemic level because of the amount of carbon emissions that we're putting in for energy, also for agriculture that's being done in a way that is not regenerative. So we're still, 2021 was, yes, 2022, our emissions went right back up to where they were before the pandemic. Everybody was optimistic, okay, the pandemic has slowed everything down, it's given us a chance to think about how important nature is. We're right back to where we were. So we are doing as much of our part as we can. North Carolina actually has had some pretty progressive legislation about carbon emissions, and we'll talk about that in the next class. The governor and the Republican General Assembly agreed on what I still think is a rather remarkable carbon emissions bill. And we're going to also talk a little bit about Duke Energy's recent carbon plan that they submitted with a lot of outcry, and the North Carolina Utilities Commission approved it in December. There's been a lot of criticism about that. But Duke Energy is required to submit that as part of North Carolina's new carbon law. And we're going to talk about ways that those of us who choose to can engage with Duke Energy, with the Utilities Commission, and with our North Carolina elected officials to say, hey, Duke, that's not good enough. That's too much reliance on fossil fuels still, which are unpredictable, which is why we had blackouts this past winter. They're also unpredictably expensive. Focus more on clean energy and renewable. So on the one hand, yes, great, let's keep doing it. But on the other hand, not even. I mean, all we can do, my mother asked me this. My mother turns 90 tomorrow. And she says, well, what can we do? And I said, what we can do is everything we can do. It is all hands on deck. Yes?
Water. You emphasize the rains that come and big flood causes. And we know there's droughts that occur too in our country, particularly out in the west. That's a travesty. What is being done in terms of research or planning to capture that excess rain and store it for water? As our population grows, as the droughts come, we must conserve that water in those, it seems to me, in those heavy rain periods. What's happening in that area?
Well, that's a great question that I am not sure I can really answer the way that I think you're hoping that I could, but I can tell you within my own area of knowledge and familiarity that as we restore floodplains and wetlands, we give rain, even in these deluges that are just massive, crazy rain events that a lot of people attribute to climate change. When we allow that to spread out and soak in, then you regenerate the water table much more effectively than when it runs off very quickly through an incised, washed out stream like the one I showed a picture of. Imagine that on a much larger scale, and imagine a lot of pavement. That water rushes downstream and rushes out into the ocean before they can do before it can do much good. What's being done to try to capture that huge volume of water and put it in reservoirs or tanks? That's unfortunately I'm not qualified to answer.
We also
watch the documentary State of Change. You'll get some ideas from that.
Yeah.
They're small, but like Princeville, when it flooded their school. And their they gutted the school, but they left the building. But what they're doing around that school to capture the water and take it away from that school, and how they rebuilt the inside of that school is phenomenal for that little town.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things along the coast that they're doing, the oyster things, the wetlands, how they're pulling them back out and all that. Really watch that documentary, State of Change. It's
Also, the aquifers we know are being drained.
Yes.
And they're not being replenished. Now that is some way to do it, you said, but is any research going on how we can replenish the aquifers to store that water?
I'm sure yes. I don't know of specific research that I can direct you to. One thing I will tell you is that we've seen multiple applications in our new flood risk reduction program for something called water farming. And that's where a farmer has a field that he or she is looking for other uses for, or perhaps use in another season. And they will build berms around these enormous fields. And the berms can be 18 inches high, they can be 36 inches high, and when it rains, that thing fills up like a great big, like that football field that we saw in Canton, which was not a good thing, but this is intentional. And a lot of research is being done about that. NC State is leading a lot of that research. The Nature Conservancy is doing it. And not only are they capturing the water and allowing it to slow down and sink in and not rush down through Canton all at once, but they have these really carefully calibrated ways of releasing the water based on how much water there is and also what the weather forecast is, like when's it going to rain again. So again, not answering your question about what research regarding recharging the water table, but great question. I'd like to continue to explore that because it is interesting in California to see rain, but there's still a drought. Yeah. I hear you. Yes, ma'am.
Really quick, is there any further talk or kind of, I used to know getting off coal University? And the reason I say this is because I rails to trails, and I think we have such a gold mine if we can convert that rail that's used twice a week into something that goes from here to Hillsborough. You think of like the Swamp Island Trail, all these biking trails that communities make so much money on from tourism. We have a natural in our backyard. We could get rid of.
Let's spend the next 7 days trying to find more information about that and talk about that in the clean energy class next Sunday, because that's a great question. For heaven's sakes, UNC.
Yeah.
Really?
And
We're still burning coal.
on a tourism gold mine.
Yeah.
And Chapel Hill and Hillsborough would make so much money. You think of all these biking trails in Virginia and North Carolina, the Virginia Creeper, or the Swamp Island Trail in Greenville.
Yeah.
They make so much money.
Yeah, they do. Land and water conservation and clean energy transitions are good business. That's how we've been able to sell this primarily in the North Carolina General Assembly. These dollars that we spend on land and water conservation, they're great for business. Businesses want to come to North Carolina because of our mountains, our Piedmont, and our seashores. They want to come here because we have clean water. Why do you think New Belgium and Sierra Nevada have enormous beer making operations in Asheville. Because the Asheville watershed, all 20,000 acres of it, going all the way up to the Blue Ridge Parkway, is forever conserved. And who holds that conservation easement? The Conservation Trust for North Carolina. Rock on. And they shot the Hunger Games there. Parts of it.
All right, everybody go watch the youth who are preaching. They're our future.